The cemetery was cloaked in a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the soft sobs of mourners gathered around the freshly dug grave. Rain drizzled from the gray sky, as if heaven itself was mourning the loss of a life taken too soon. Among the crowd stood 6-year-old Liam, his small frame trembling, his tiny hands clutching a worn-out teddy bear, his mother's last gift to him. His wide, tear-filled eyes stared at the wooden coffin being lowered into the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Everyone assumed it was the innocent grief of a child who couldn't comprehend death. But Liam knew something they didn't. As the priest recited the final prayers and the first shovelful of dirt hit the coffin, Liam's whimpers turned into desperate screams. "Stop! Please stop!" He lunged forward, his small fingers digging into the wet soil. "She's not dead. She's still alive. Don't leave her there." His voice was raw, filled with a terror that sent chills down the spines of those present. Aunt Martha, his temporary guardian, pulled him back gently, her own face streaked with tears. "Liam, sweetheart, I know it's hard, but she's gone." "No, no, she's not," Liam thrashed, his cries growing more frantic. "I can feel her. She's scared. She's calling me." The crowd exchanged uneasy glances. Some whispered about the poor boy's delusions, others about the trauma of losing his mother so suddenly. But at the back of the gathering, a tall man in a black overcoat watched with sharp, calculating eyes. Richard Moore, a billionaire known for his ruthless business empire and a secret obsession with unexplained phenomena, especially when children were involved. Something in Liam's desperation struck him, not just grief, but certainty. As the funeral ended and the mourners dispersed, Richard lingered, his gaze fixed on the small boy being led away, still screaming for his mother. And then, under the cover of the stormy night, Richard made a call. "Get me an emergency exhumation order and a medical team. Now." The rain had turned into a relentless downpour by the time Richard Moore's private security team arrived at the cemetery, accompanied by a discreet medical unit. The graveyard was deserted now, the mourners long gone, leaving behind only the fresh mound of earth marking the final resting place of Liam's mother, Evelyn Carter. Richard stood under a black umbrella, his sharp eyes scanning the area for any unwanted witnesses. He had pulled strings, calling in favors, leveraging his influence to secure a rushed exhumation order. The authorities had been reluctant, but money and power had a way of bending rules, especially when Richard hinted at the possibility of a crime. The dig began in silence, the only sounds being the rhythmic thud of shovels hitting wet soil and the distant rumble of thunder. Richard watched, his jaw clenched, his mind racing. What if the boy was right? The thought was absurd, and yet he had seen something in Liam's eyes, an unshakable conviction that defied logic. Richard had spent years investigating bizarre cases, particularly those involving children who claimed impossible things, only to later uncover unsettling truths. He couldn't ignore this one. As the coffin was finally unearthed and the lid pried open, the medical team rushed forward. The moment the flashlight beams fell on Evelyn's face, one of the doctors gasped. Her skin was pale, her lips slightly blue, but, against all odds, there was the faintest mist on the cold metal of a mirror held to her mouth. A weak pulse flickered at her wrist. "She's alive," the doctor whispered, disbelief thick in his voice. Richard's blood ran cold. Buried alive. The implications were horrifying. This wasn't an accident. Someone had wanted her silenced. The medical team worked frantically, administering oxygen and stimulants, stabilizing her for transport. Richard's mind was already piecing together the fragments of what he knew. Evelyn had been a nurse at Silverwood Medical Center, a place recently embroiled in scandal, whistleblower allegations, missing files, a sudden, natural death. And now, her own son's cries had unearthed the truth. As the ambulance sped away into the night, Richard made another call, this time to his most trusted investigator. Dig up everything on Silverwood Hospital and find out who wanted Evelyn Carter dead. Meanwhile, in a quiet house on the outskirts of town, Liam sat by the window, his small face pressed against the glass, tears still streaming down his cheeks. But for the first time since the funeral, his lips curled into the faintest smile. He had heard her voice. The sterile white lights of the private hospital room hummed softly as Evelyn Carter lay motionless, her chest rising and falling in shallow mechanical breaths. Tubes snaked from her arms, machines beeping in steady rhythm, the only signs that life still clung stubbornly to her battered body. The doctors had called it a miracle. No one should have survived being drugged into a death-like coma and buried underground for hours. Yet here she was, hovering between worlds, her mind trapped in a fog of half-remembered terror. Richard Moore stood at the foot of her bed, arms crossed, his usual air of unshakable confidence replaced by something darker. The preliminary medical report had confirmed his suspicions. Traces of a potent sedative in Evelyn's bloodstream, one used in surgical anesthesia but never in fatal doses, unless someone wanted her to appear dead. The question gnawed at him. Who would go this far to silence a nurse? His investigators' early findings painted a troubling picture. Silverwood Medical Center had been under scrutiny for malpractice, fraudulent billing, even whispers of illegal organ harvesting. Evelyn had been gathering evidence, and then, abruptly, she had collapsed at home, pronounced dead within hours. Too fast, too convenient. A soft knock at the door pulled Richard from his thoughts. Liam stood there, clutching his teddy bear, his eyes wide and hopeful. The boy hadn't been allowed to see his mother yet. Too unstable, the doctors had said, but Richard had overruled them. He crouched to meet Liam's gaze. "She's sleeping very deeply," he said carefully, "but she's going to wake up." Liam didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the bedside and placed his small hand over Evelyn's. A moment passed. Then another. Then, her fingers twitched. The machines erupted in frantic beeping as Evelyn's eyelids fluttered, her breath hitching. Liam didn't move, didn't even seem surprised. "I told you," he whispered. "She was calling me." Richard's phone buzzed, a message from his investigator. "Found something. You need to see this." Down the hall, in the hospital's empty cafeteria, Richard scrolled through the files sent to him. Security footage from Silverwood. Evelyn arguing with a man in a lab coat the night before. Her death. Financial records, showing massive payouts to a shell company. And then, the kicker, a grainy photo of the hospital's chief administrator shaking hands with a known crime syndicate fixer. This wasn't just a cover-up, it was a conspiracy, and Evelyn Carter was the one person who could bring it all crashing down. The hospital corridor was eerily quiet at this late hour, the only sound the distant echo of footsteps and the occasional murmur of a nurse on rounds. Richard Moore leaned against the wall outside Evelyn's room, his mind racing through the implications of what he'd just uncovered. The pieces were falling into place with chilling clarity. Silverwood wasn't just cutting corners. It was a front for something far darker, and Evelyn had stumbled into the heart of it. But now that she was alive, she was in more danger than ever. Whoever had tried to bury their secret with her wouldn't hesitate to finish the job. Inside, the room. Liam had fallen asleep in the chair beside his mother's bed, his small fingers still curled around hers. Evelyn's condition had stabilized, but she hadn't yet woken fully, drifting in and out of consciousness. Each time she stirred, her lips moved as if trying to form words, but no sound came out. The doctors said it was the lingering effects of the drugs, but Richard wondered if it was something else. Fear, desperation, the weight of what she knew pressing against her throat like a hand she couldn't shake off. His phone buzzed again, another message from his investigator. "They're watching the hospital. Be careful." Richard's jaw tightened. He'd expected this. If the people behind Silverwood had gone to such lengths to silence Evelyn, They wouldn't just let her wake up and start talking. He signaled to the 2 bodyguards he'd stationed outside the room. "No one comes in unless I clear them," he said quietly. "Not even hospital staff." The men nodded, their expressions grim. Back in the room, Richard studied Evelyn's face. The faint lines of stress around her eyes. The way her breath hitched slightly, as if she were fighting her way back to consciousness. He thought of Liam's unwavering certainty that she was alive, the way the boy had known in a way that defied logic. Was it just a child's intuition, or something deeper? Richard had spent years chasing the unexplained, but this felt different. A soft groan from the bed snapped his attention back. Evelyn's eyelids fluttered, then opened, her gaze unfocused at first before slowly sharpening. She tried to speak, her voice a rasp. "Liam?" The boy stirred at the sound of her voice, his eyes flying open. "Mommy!" He lunged forward, burying his face in her shoulder. Evelyn's arms trembled as she wrapped them around him, her tears silent but fierce. Richard gave them a moment before stepping closer. "Evelyn," he said gently. "Do you remember what happened?" Her breath caught, and when she looked at him, her eyes were wide with something beyond fear, something like resignation. They injected me," she whispered. "I saw the files. I knew too much." Her grip on Liam tightened. They were going to kill us both. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Richard felt a cold rage settle in his chest. This wasn't just about corruption anymore. It was about survival, and he was going to make sure they all survived. The dim glow of the hospital room's monitors cast flickering shadows across Evelyn's face as she struggled to piece and together the fragments of her shattered memory. The drugs had left her mind in a haze, but the terror, that was sharp, cutting through the fog like a blade. She remembered the cold press of a needle against her arm, the way her vision had blurred as she collapsed onto the kitchen floor, Liam's screams echoing in her ears as darkness swallowed her whole. She remembered the suffocating weight of earth pressing down on her coffin, the way her lungs had burned as she fought to draw breath in the cramped, airless space. But most of all, she remembered the files, the damning evidence she'd hidden away, proof of what Silverwood was really doing behind its pristine white walls. Richard watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. He needed answers, but he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her hands trembled against the sheets. Still, time wasn't a luxury they had. "Evelyn," he said, keeping his voice low so as not to startle Liam, who had fallen back asleep in the chair beside her, his small body curled into a ball. "Where are the files now?" Evelyn swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Safe," she whispered. "I gave them to someone I trust. But if they find out I'm alive—" Her voice broke and she clutched Liam's hand tighter, as if afraid he'd be ripped away from her at any moment. Richard didn't need her to finish the sentence. He'd seen the kind of men they were dealing with, the kind who buried nurses alive to keep their secrets, the kind who wouldn't hesitate to hurt a child. He leaned in closer, his voice a barely audible murmur. "Tell me where they are. I can protect you. Both of you." For a long moment, Evelyn hesitated, her eyes darting to Liam's sleeping form. Then, with a shaky breath, she nodded. "Under the floorboards," she said, "in Liam's room. There's a loose panel near the closet. The files are there." Richard straightened, his mind already racing ahead. He needed to move fast, before Silverwood's people realized Evelyn was awake, before they could track down the evidence she'd hidden. He turned to the bodyguard stationed at the door. "Double the security. No one comes near this room." Then, to Evelyn, "I'll be back soon. Don't trust anyone until then." As he strode down the hallway, his phone buzzed. Another update from his investigator. The pieces were coming together, and the picture they painted was uglier than he'd imagined. Silverwood wasn't just involved in fraud. They were trafficking black market pharmaceuticals, selling experimental drugs to the highest bidder. No, matter the cost in human lives. And Evelyn had the proof. But Richard wasn't the only one looking for it. As he stepped out into the hospital parking lot, a shadow detached itself from the wall nearby, falling into step behind him. Richard didn't turn, didn't give any sign he'd noticed, but his hand drifted to the concealed weapon at his side, his fingers brushing cold metal. They were watching, and they were getting closer. The night air was thick with tension as Richard Moore stepped into the dimly lit parking lot, his senses on high alert. The shadow trailing him maintained a careful distance, close enough to follow, but not close enough to provoke. Richard didn't turn around, didn't react. He had played this game before, and he knew the rules. Whoever was following him wanted something, and until they made their move, he would let them believe they had the upper hand. His fingers tightened around the phone in his pocket, the screen still glowing with his investigator's last message. They know about the boy. They're coming for the files. A cold knot formed in Richard's stomach. Liam was safe for now, guarded by his most trusted men. But the files, those were still vulnerable. And if Silverwood's people got to them first, Evelyn's testimony would mean nothing. He quickened his pace, weaving through the rows of parked cars until he reached his own, a sleek black vehicle with tinted windows. As he slid into the driver's seat, he caught a glimpse of movement in the rearview mirror. A figure in a dark hoodie lingered near the hospital entrance, watching. Richard didn't wait. The engine roared to life, and he pulled out of the parking lot with deliberate speed, his mind already mapping the fastest route to Evelyn's house. The streets were nearly empty at this hour, the occasional streetlight casting long, ghostly shadows across the asphalt. His thoughts raced ahead of him, calculating risks, anticipating traps. He knew they would be waiting. They had to be. Meanwhile, back in the hospital room, Evelyn stirred restlessly, her sleep fractured by nightmares she couldn't escape. In the chair beside her, Liam slept fitfully, his small face scrunched in discomfort. The machines beeped steadily, a reassuring rhythm that did little to ease the unease settling over the room. Outside the door, the bodyguards stood vigilant, their eyes scanning the hallway for any sign of threat. But they didn't see the figure in the nurse's uniform approaching, her face obscured by a surgical mask, her steps silent against the linoleum floor. She paused outside the door, her gloved hand hovering over the keycard reader. The guards tensed, but before they could react, the overhead lights flickered, once, twice, then plunged the hallway into darkness. In the sudden blackness, no one heard the soft click of the door unlocking. The darkness in the hospital corridor was absolute, swallowing even the faint glow of emergency exit signs as if the building itself had been plunged into a void. The two bodyguards stationed outside Evelyn's room moved instantly, their training overriding surprise as they reached for weapons and communication devices. But the radios only responded with static. Someone was jamming their signals. The taller guard pressed his back against the wall, his pistol sweeping the inky blackness as he whispered to his partner, "Check the room. Now." Inside, Evelyn's heart pounded as she heard the electronic lock disengage. The machines monitoring her vitals began screaming alarms as her pulse skyrocketed. She reached blindly for Liam, her fingers finding his shoulder just as the door creaked open. A sliver of dim light from the hallway silhouetted a figure that was definitely not hospital staff. The way it moved was all wrong. Too deliberate, too predatory. Liam woke with a gasp as Evelyn pulled him onto the bed, her body shielding his. "Mommy!" His voice trembled with sleep and sudden fear. Before she could answer, a new sound cut through the darkness, the unmistakable click of a gun safety being disengaged. Then the world exploded in light and noise. Richard burst through the emergency stairwell door at the end of the hall, flanked by 3 additional security personnel. Their high-powered flashlights illuminated the scene like a grotesque stage play, the fake nurse turning with inhuman speed, the glint of metal in her hand, the bodyguards shouting warnings. "Down!" Richard's voice carried the weight of command. Evelyn reacted instantly, dragging Liam beneath her as the first gunshot shattered the silence. The would-be assassin's bullet embedded itself in the wall where Evelyn's head had been a second before. What followed was a storm of controlled violence. Richard's team moved with surgical precision, their return fire driving the attacker back. The woman in the nurse's uniform moved like a specter, dodging with unnatural agility before launching herself through the window at the hall's end in a shower of breaking glass. By the time Richard reached Evelyn and Liam, the danger had passed. As suddenly as it appeared, the bodyguards were already securing the area while medical staff came rushing from other wards, drawn by the gunfire. Evelyn clutched Liam to her chest, both of them shaking but unharmed. Richard knelt beside the bed, his usually composed face etched with rare emotion. "I got the files," he said quietly, patting the briefcase at his side. "Enough evidence to bury Silverwood and everyone involved." His eyes flicked to the broken window where the assassin had escaped. "But they know that, which means we have until dawn, before all hell breaks loose." As if on cue, Richard's phone buzzed. He listened for a moment before his expression hardened into something dangerous. "The FBI's raiding Silverwood as we speak. The administrator just tried to flee the country." He looked at Evelyn, then at Liam, who was watching him with wide, trusting eyes. "It's over. You're safe." Outside, the first hints of dawn painted the sky in pale gold. The nightmare was ending. But as Richard helped Evelyn and Liam gather their few belongings, he knew this wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning. The boy who had defied death to save his mother, the billionaire who had believed the impossible, and the woman who had uncovered terrible secrets. Their lives were now inextricably linked by what had happened in that cemetery. And as the sun rose fully over the city, casting long shadows across the hospital parking lot, none of them noticed the black sedan parked across the street, or the figure inside watching through tinted windows, a phone pressed to their ear. Because some secrets don't stay buried, and some enemies don't give up.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.